The phone calls started in March of 1981, 8 months before Natalie Wood's body would be found floating in the dark waters off Catalina Island. At first, they seemed like nothing more than a nuisance: heavy breathing, long silences, the occasional hang-up when she answered. But by October, those calls had evolved into something far more sinister, something that would transform Hollywood's most radiant star into a woman consumed by terror. What happened to Natalie Wood during those final 8 months of her life has remained one of Hollywood's most carefully guarded secrets. Not because the evidence doesn't exist, but because too many powerful people have spent 40 years making sure no one looked too closely at what was really happening behind the carefully maintained facade of her perfect life. This is that story, the one that was never told in police reports, never explored in official investigations, never acknowledged by those who claim to love her most. It's a story about systematic psychological warfare, about a woman being slowly destroyed by forces she couldn't identify or escape. And it begins not with her death, but with the moment she first realized that someone was watching her every move. The harassment began subtly, almost imperceptibly. Natalie would arrive home to find things slightly out of place. A book moved on her coffee table, a chair pulled away from her desk, makeup items rearranged in her bathroom. The changes were so minor that she initially dismissed them as her own forgetfulness, the natural chaos of a busy life. But then the calls intensified, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. She started writing everything down. Her sister Lana Wood would later reveal every strange call, every weird incident, every time something felt off. She had notebooks full of dates and times and details that she was collecting like evidence, but evidence of what she couldn't say. These notebooks were never mentioned in any official investigation, and their current whereabouts remain unknown. The calls weren't random. They came at specific times, always when Natalie was alone, always when she was most vulnerable. The callers seemed to know her schedule, her routines, her habits. They knew when Robert Wagner would be out of town, when the housekeeper would be gone, when Natalie would be by herself in the large, isolated house she'd begun to think of as a prison rather than a home. It felt like someone was living my life alongside me, she confided to her friend Mart Crowley in May of 1981. Like they knew everything I was doing before I did it. This conversation was recorded in Crowley's personal diary, entries that weren't discovered until years after his death in 2020. But the phone calls were just the beginning. By summer, the harassment had escalated into something far more invasive and psychologically devastating. Natalie began receiving packages at her home, unmarked boxes containing photographs of herself that she'd never seen before. Not publicity shots or paparazzi photos, but intimate pictures taken from a distance, captured when she thought she was unobserved. Pictures of her in her garden, through her bedroom window, getting into her car in her own driveway. Someone had been watching her for months, possibly years, documenting her life in terrifying detail, and they wanted her to know it. She showed me some of those pictures, revealed Julie Payne, a close friend who had remained silent about Natalie's final months until recently. They were taken with a telephoto lens from somewhere outside her property. Some of them were shot from angles that suggested the photographer had been hiding in the bushes or trees around her house. It was absolutely chilling. Payne's statement was given to private investigators in 2019, but was never included in any official case files. The photographs weren't random either. They seemed designed to demonstrate just how vulnerable Natalie was, how completely her privacy had been invaded. There were pictures of her reading by her pool, talking on the phone in what she thought was the privacy of her bedroom, even sleeping. The message was clear. There was nowhere she could go where she wasn't being watched. But here's what makes this harassment campaign particularly sinister, and what suggests it wasn't the work of a typical stalker. The person behind it had access to information that should have been confidential. They knew Natalie's unlisted phone numbers, even when she changed them. They knew her shooting schedule for Brainstorm before the call sheets were distributed. They knew when she had medical appointments, when she was meeting with her therapist, when she was having lunch with friends. This wasn't some random obsessive fan operating from the outside. This was someone with access to the inner circles of Natalie's professional and personal life. She became convinced that someone close to her was feeding information to whoever was doing this, Payne recalled. She started testing people, telling different stories to different friends to see which version would come back to haunt her. She was trying to identify the source, but it was making her paranoid about everyone in her life. The psychological toll was devastating. Natalie, who had always been somewhat anxious and insecure despite her public confidence, began showing signs of severe emotional distress. She lost weight, had trouble sleeping, jumped at unexpected sounds. She installed new security systems, changed her locks multiple times, and began carrying a small tape recorder so she could document the threatening calls. But the most disturbing aspect of her ordeal was how isolated she became in dealing with it. Robert Wagner, according to multiple sources, dismissed her fears as paranoia brought on by stress and prescription medication. When she showed him the photographs, he suggested they were taken by paparazzi or overzealous fans, nothing to be seriously concerned about. When she played him recordings of the threatening calls, he said she was overreacting to what were probably just prank calls. RJ didn't want to hear about it, confided Dennis Davern, who worked closely with the Wagner family during this period. He seemed almost annoyed when she brought up her fears, like she was being dramatic or seeking attention. But those of us who worked in the house could see how terrified she really was. This reaction, or lack of reaction, from Wagner raises troubling questions about what he might have known about the source of Natalie's harassment. By October 1981, just weeks before her death, the psychological warfare had intensified to a truly terrifying level. Natalie began finding evidence that someone had been inside her house while she was away. Not breaking in. There was never any sign of forced entry, but someone with access, someone with keys, someone who could come and go without leaving obvious traces. Personal items would disappear and then reappear in different locations. Her private journals, in which she'd been documenting the harassment, would be moved from her bedroom to other parts of the house, as if to demonstrate that even her most intimate thoughts weren't private. Most disturbing of all, she began finding photographs of herself that had been taken inside her home, in rooms where no photographer should have had access. She called me crying one night. Lana Wood remembered. She said she'd found a picture of herself sleeping in her own bed, taken from inside her bedroom. Someone had been in her room while she was unconscious and vulnerable, taking pictures. She was absolutely terrified. This incident was never reported to police, despite Lana's urging that Natalie contact authorities immediately. But Natalie was afraid to go to the police for reasons that revealed just how trapped she had become. The harassment wasn't just psychological, it was also strategic. Whoever was tormenting her had made it clear that they had access to deeply personal and potentially damaging information about her life. They knew things about her that nobody should have known. Payne revealed personal details about her relationships, her finances, her family problems. They were using this information to make it clear that if she tried to expose them, they could destroy her reputation and career in return. The harassment had become a form of emotional blackmail, trapping Natalie in a situation where seeking help might result in even greater violation of her privacy and dignity. But this raises the most disturbing question of all. Who had this level of access to Natalie's personal life? Who could come and go from her home freely? Who had intimate knowledge of her schedule, her relationships, her private affairs? The answer, according to several sources who have remained silent until recently, points to someone within Natalie's inner circle, someone she trusted, someone who had legitimate reasons to be in her home, someone who could monitor her activities without raising suspicion. She suspected everyone by the end. Davern revealed in a previously unpublished interview, her friends, her employees, even family members. The harassment had been so systematic, so thorough that she couldn't trust anyone. But there was one person she never suspected, one person who was always above suspicion. Davern refused to identify this person directly, but his implications were clear enough to send chills through anyone familiar with the case. The final weeks of October 1981 saw an escalation that was both more subtle and more threatening than anything that had come before. Instead of obvious harassment, Natalie began experiencing what she described as psychological gaslighting. Her reality was being systematically undermined in ways that made her question her own perceptions. Conversations she remembered having were denied by others. Plans she thought she'd made were mysteriously canceled or changed. People began treating her as if she was becoming unstable, unreliable, paranoid. It was like someone was orchestrating a campaign to make her seem crazy, observed Dr. Harold Greenbaum, a psychiatrist who treated Natalie during this period, but was bound by patient confidentiality until his death in 2015. She was being systematically isolated, made to feel like she couldn't trust her own judgment or rely on anyone else for support. Dr. Greenbaum's notes, released by his estate, reveal that Natalie had become convinced that someone was trying to drive her to a mental breakdown, not just for psychological satisfaction, but for very specific practical reasons. She believed that if she could be made to appear mentally unstable, it would be easier to control her career, her finances, her personal decisions, the notes reveal. She thought someone was trying to gain legal and financial control over her life by undermining her competency. This theory gains credibility when examined alongside the financial and legal arrangements surrounding Natalie's career and personal wealth. In the months before her death, significant changes had been made to her contracts, her insurance policies, and her estate planning, changes that she reportedly didn't fully understand and hadn't initiated herself. But here's where the story becomes even more disturbing. The weekend of November 27th, 1981, the weekend that would end with Natalie's death, wasn't a spontaneous getaway, as it was later portrayed. It had been planned for weeks, arranged by Robert Wagner despite Natalie's repeated objections and her specific fear of being trapped on a boat. According to Davern's most recent statements, Wagner had been insistent about the trip, dismissive of Natalie's concerns, almost aggressive in his determination that they would go regardless of her comfort level. She didn't want to be alone on a boat with him, Davern revealed. She'd grown afraid of him over the past few months, afraid of his anger, his need to control everything about her life. But she was also afraid of what would happen if she refused to go. The presence of Christopher Walken on the trip, which was presented as a casual invitation to a friend, was actually something more calculated. Walken was there, according to sources close to the situation, because Natalie felt she needed a witness, someone whose presence might prevent the kind of confrontation she'd grown to fear from her husband. She told me she felt safer when other people were around, Payne recalled. She'd grown afraid of being alone with RJ, afraid of what he might do when no one was watching. But what exactly was Natalie afraid Wagner might do? The answer to that question may lie in incidents that occurred during the months leading up to their final trip, incidents that were carefully covered up but left witnesses who have carried their secrets for 40 years. There had been violence before, a former household employee revealed anonymously. Not just arguments, but physical intimidation, grabbing, pushing. Natalie would come to work with bruises she couldn't explain, marks on her arms that looked like fingerprints. But she never complained, never reported it, never even acknowledged it directly. This pattern of domestic violence, according to multiple sources, had been escalating throughout 1981, parallel to the psychological harassment that was destroying Natalie's sense of security and reality. The question that haunts everyone who has studied this case is whether these two campaigns, the external harassment and the domestic violence, were connected. Was Wagner behind both, using psychological warfare to soften Natalie's resistance before escalating to physical control? Or was he taking advantage of her vulnerability to assert dominance over a woman who was already being destroyed by forces beyond her control? The truth may be even more sinister, that the harassment campaign was designed specifically to make Natalie dependent on Wagner for protection, to isolate her from friends and support systems, to make her feel like he was the only person she could trust, even as he was becoming the very thing she most needed protection from. The final piece of this puzzle lies in what happened immediately after Natalie's death. The speed with which evidence was disposed of, witnesses were silenced, and the official narrative was established and defended. Within hours of her body being discovered, Natalie's personal belongings were removed from the yacht and taken back to the family home, where they were sorted through by Wagner and his associates before police had a chance to examine them thoroughly. Her notebooks documenting the harassment, her tape recordings of threatening calls, her collection of invasive photographs, all of this evidence vanished into private hands before it could become part of any official investigation. The cleanup was immediate and thorough, Davern observed. It was like they'd been planning for this moment, like they knew exactly what needed to be removed and destroyed. The people who had been closest to Natalie during her final months, her friends, her employees, her confidants, were quickly isolated from the investigation, their statements taken privately and then never followed up on. Several were reportedly offered financial incentives to remain silent about what they'd witnessed. We were all told that talking about Natalie's private struggles would only hurt her memory and her family, Payne revealed. We were made to feel like keeping silent was the loyal, loving thing to do. But 40 years later, I realized that our silence may have protected the very people who destroyed her. The official investigation focused exclusively on the events of that final weekend, treating Natalie's death as an isolated incident rather than the culmination of months of systematic psychological and physical abuse. No one looked into the harassment campaign, the domestic violence, the evidence of stalking and intimidation that had defined her final year of life. And so the truth about what really happened to Natalie Wood has remained buried, not because the evidence didn't exist, but because too many people had reasons to make sure it never came to light. What we're left with is a story that's far more disturbing than a simple boating accident, far more complex than a crime of passion, far more systematic than anyone has been willing to acknowledge. It's the story of a woman who was slowly, methodically destroyed by people who claimed to love her, who was isolated and terrorized until she had nowhere left to turn. The water that took Natalie's life that November night may have been the instrument of her death, but the real cause was the months of psychological warfare that preceded it. The campaign of fear and control that left her vulnerable, desperate, and ultimately defenseless against the very people who should have protected her. Her death certificate lists drowning as the cause, but the real cause was something far more human and far more evil. The systematic destruction of a woman's sense of safety, security, and self-worth by people who had the power to help her but chose instead to use that power against her. The case remains officially open, but the real investigation has never begun, because it would require looking not just at one night in November, but at 8 months of evidence that someone made sure would disappear forever. The truth about Natalie Wood isn't hidden in the dark waters off Catalina Island. It's buried in the silence of people who know exactly what happened, but have spent 40 years making sure no one else ever will. And somewhere in that silence lies the answer to who really killed Natalie Wood, and why they've been allowed to get away with it for so long.